Hey guys, I'm Pat, and today I'm going to be showing you how to style your code properly and make it more readable and efficient, so that way people don't bully you when you try to ask for help with your code. So in this video I'm going to have a few different scripts, and in each one they're all going to have a few different things wrong with them that can be improved to make the scripts more readable and efficient. So I'm just going to be going over those scripts and showing you ways that you can improve those scripts. So the first script is called lack of Vars, and basically this is a script that when the proximity part is triggered, it will make the part like a random color. So the thing that's wrong with this script is that there's a lot of text here. It's only really a 3-line script, but you see how long the text is, and really this is kind of pointless to have it drawn out so long. You can make it a lot more easier to read and a lot more cleaner looking. So what we'll do first is make a variable to store our part lack of Vars, right? And we're going to use workspace, because actually you don't need to index workspace with game. You can just type in workspace alone, it's already a global, and then you can just reference your variable straight away. So with that, we can get rid of all this text here and just make it part, and then we can also get rid of this here and make it part.color. So that way, you know, it made it a lot shorter and cleaner. You can also make a variable for the proximity prompt. I wouldn't say that that's really needed in this case, because see, in this case we're using we're referencing the part multiple times, so it's a little bit better to have a variable for that because we're referencing it multiple times. So it's not really needed for the proximity prompt because we're just using it for this function here. Another thing I kind of wanted to go over in the script was difference between like anonymous functions and like separating the function and connecting it separately. So you can see here, this right here is actually called an anonymous function because the function is not named. It's just straight connected to the triggered event from the proximity prompt. But what we can actually do is we can define a separate function, like not a very clever name. It could definitely be a lot shorter, but so we just define a function like that, right? And now we can do the same thing in here, but we can actually get rid of all this down here. And hopefully this makes sense, but basically it's the same thing that we had before. We have a function up here, and it's literally the same thing, but instead of having the function defined right in with the event, we just define it up here separately. And then later on in the script, we connect the triggered event to this function here, and then it will execute the code when the event's triggered. So it's basically the same thing, but you know, it can be neater this way. Some people prefer to do it this way. I personally just make my functions anonymous for the most part, but there are just two different ways of doing it, and I see a lot of people like having inconsistencies with how they connect their events to their functions. So I suggest that, you know, usually you just pick one of the ways and you can consistently use that way. However, there might be cases where you might want to do it differently. It depends, right? But it's important that when, you know, you're writing your code that you're consistent with how you style it, because inconsistencies like makes it harder for you to go back over it and read it, and it makes it a lot more of a mess and a lot more ugly. So the next part I want to do was this is a leader stat script example, and another thing just to take note is white space. Like for this script, I don't really need like an empty 3 lines up here, but I kind of will in a few seconds. Actually, it doesn't matter, it's whatever. We'll just get rid of those lines for now. So what we're doing in the script is we're using a player added event to detect when a player joins the game, and then once they join the game, we create a new folder, name it leader stats, and we parent it to the player, and we also create a int value called money, and we parent it to the leader stats folder. So there's a few things wrong with the script. Obviously, there's probably a bunch of people that have already seen like some main issues, but one of the biggest issues that's kind of screaming at you is like the variable names are just one letters. This is pretty bad practice. It's really kind of ugly, and you don't really know what these variables are storing inside of them. It's just like P, L, M. If somebody else were to try to read this code and try and edit it, or if it's like a group project or something and there's other scripters using your code, it's going to be very hard for them to kind of tell what things are just based off of single letter variable names. Obviously in this script it's very small, so it's kind of easy to figure it out, but you know, if it's a 100-line or so script, you don't want people to spend like half an hour just trying to figure out what your variable names are or what your variables are storing because you named your variables like single letters like L or M. So usually you're going to want to name, I mean, you could even do like 3-letter, like PLR, that's obviously player, right? So you can just do that instead of just P. And leader stats, I mean, you can have different names. You can always change the name, but as long as you know you can read and you're like, oh, that's what that's for, it makes it kind of easier to understand for other people and yourself if you ever had to read over your old code. And another thing is when you're using instance.new, you can obviously parent the instance that you're creating to whatever instance you want with the second argument here. So we got player and we're parenting it to the player here. But this is actually bad practice and it's considered inefficient, unoptimized. So usually what you want to do, instead of passing the instance you want to use as a parent in the second variable or argument, I mean, you want to set it manually outside of the instance.new function or whatever, right? So here we set it outside, and this is actually more optimized, and it actually does kind of look a little bit better. I mean, it kind of depends on how you feel. It might be a little bit more clear to define it in there, but it's considered bad practice and it's unoptimized, so I wouldn't suggest it. And we can do the same thing down here. If I can, you know, gain a few chromosomes here and remember how to type, there we go. So now we're just setting the parent manually instead of using a second argument. And then the last thing I want to go over in this function is game.players. Now this is a server script, so it doesn't necessarily matter too much, but the thing with using game.players or game.replicated storage or game.server storage or whatever is that these service names can actually, their names can be changed by people developing the game or by scripts injected by executor or exploiters. So if somebody's exploiting their game on the client side, they can change your service names, and then that can cause errors in your scripts. And especially if you have some kind of anti-cheat that relies on that, that can be an issue. And another thing is if it's a group game, you know, you might have people that don't necessarily know what they're doing, or they might have a reason they changed the name of services. And if the name is changed, then you can't directly index it from game. So usually it's better to use GetService, and overall it's just a better practice, and it'll be more consistent in your code because, you know, there's services like marketplace service, like game. You can do game.marketplace service, but that's not like something that people actually do. They use GetService for marketplace service and users input service and context action service, whatever. And it makes it more consistent with your code when you use GetService for everything instead of like some things you do game dot and sometimes you do game GetService. So it's just more consistent and more clean. It makes your code look better, and if other people want to reuse your code for something, you know, and they have different service names, then, you know, it's just better practice that way. So that's all I wanted to do for this script, I think. So the next thing we're going to do is go over color changing parts example. So this is similar to the other color changing thing. It has a proximity prompt, and when it's triggered, Instead of just changing one part's color, we change like 4 parts colors. But the problem with this is, you know, you can see we're doing the same thing over and over again. If you're doing something like this where it's like very repetitive, it's the same thing over and over again, then it can be very bad practice. And there's usually, most likely, definitely a better way to do it that makes your code more clean and more efficient. Another example, like I was in a Discord server and somebody actually asked for help with a script like this. Like, I mean, look how repetitive it is. They have a ton of if statements, and they could easily be using if else, which would make the code a lot more optimized here. Because if they used if else, then after it checked one statement, if it was true, it'd skip over all the other if statements. And if they don't use else, then instead it has to go through each if statement and check to see if the condition is true or not. Even though, you know, if random does equal 0, then all these other ones are going to be false, and it's going to be extremely pointless. So that's also another thing. So the way that you can make this a little bit better is, one thing we're going to do is we're going to make a variable for a folder, and that's just going to be script.parent. So that means that we can do stuff like this. We can get rid of that. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to use a for loop. Oh god. I cannot. I am running on like 2 chromosomes today, guys. I'm sorry. Alright, but honestly. So, this is just a for loop, and we're making 2 variables, but we're kind of getting rid of the index one because we don't need that in this loop. And then for every part in the folder's children, so we're just using folder get children. Get children just returns a table. Hopefully by now you know how to use a for loop and what get children does. It's very useful, very important. You need for loops in your scripts for sure. And now what we can do is just, with each part, we can just set their color to a random color, and then with this we can get rid of all these scripts. And actually in this we should have like an if statement to check to see if the color changes part, because before I wasn't changing that color of that part, but you know, it doesn't really matter too much. It's just kind of an example here. So basically all you're gonna do is, you know, you just use for loop instead of repeating it over and over again. In some cases it might be better to use like a separate function. Like obviously this isn't a good example for it, and I didn't really come up with like a good example for like something like this, but you know, you could do make a function, and you know, if you were trying to like change the parts colors like multiple times in your script or something, which I have no idea why you'd be doing that, but you know, in that case, like, and honestly at this point it kind of becomes redundant because we can just connect the event to this function, but it doesn't matter for this explanation. Alright guys, don't worry about it. But you know, say if we want to do this multiple times, like make it kind of like a dice roll or whatever, we want to like, you know, have a wait in between each time like the color changed once we triggered it or whatever. You know, it'd be a lot cleaner to have a function, so that way we don't have to rewrite this code multiple times in our script. We can just have a function call. And you can see, like, you know, if you just look at this part, it looks a lot more cleaner like this, rather than having like this in here multiple times. Like, this just looks a lot uglier. This looks a lot more cleaner and organized. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're doing multiple things over and over again. A lot of times for loops or functions can replace that to make your code look a little bit better. And then the last thing I had was a if statement example or whatever. And in this script, you know, we have multiple if statements. We're checking multiple conditions because we're using input service to see when they press the X key. So you can see, I'm not even sure if I used the parameters in the right order here, but it doesn't matter for this example, so please don't bully me. So there's multiple ways you can make this code look a lot better. Now you can see here we indented 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Like this is 4 indentations. You can see how far over the code is. It just looks very ugly, really. We don't need this many if statements. We don't need 4 indentations. It's just not necessary at all. So one thing you can do to make this cleaner is, instead of just making separate if statements, you can use and or operators, which just kind of combines, you know, the conditions. So and we'll see if the condition on the left and the condition on the right is true, and if both are true, then it'll return true, otherwise it'll return false. So what we'll do is, instead of having 2 if statements here to compare, then we can get rid of one of them and replace it with using the ands condition there. And we can also put the debounce in there, but I'm gonna save like a different method for that. So another thing that you can keep in mind when you're using if statements and you want to avoid having like a ton of indentation that's completely pointless is you can just make 1-line if statements that will avoid making your code indent. So say you want to check to see if debounce equals false, right? Now this is another thing. Instead of doing if debounce equals false, you can just do if not debounce, and that will do the same thing. I'll check to see if not debounce, and since debounce is a Boolean value, it's either true or false. I'll check to see if it's the opposite of true, right? And if we just did if debounce, it'll check to see if debounce is true. So that's something that can make your code a lot more cleaner as well, instead of doing checking it with equals for booleans, which is very unnecessary. And you can see I kind of did the same thing here. So a way to make your code have less indentations is we can do if debounce. Now you can see we're checking to see if the debounce is true. So if it is true, then we can just return, and what return does in this case is it just completely stops the function at this line, so it won't go anywhere past this. So if the debounce is true, then it won't do any more code in this and just returns, which is what we want, because once the code's triggered, we set the debounce to true, right? So now we can actually get rid of this if statement, which gives us less indentation here. So now we only got 2 indentations, and theoretically we could only do 1 if we really wanted to, but in this case I'm not gonna go that crazy. This is just an example script. And the last thing I wanted to show you in this script is multiple ways to do debounce and also wait. So the thing about using just wait is, obviously, you know, it's a lot more easier to understand your waiting, but Task.Wait, this is actually the normal wait is actually deprecated now, which means that it's just old code and it's not going to be updated with when Roblox updates Studio, etc. It's going to be kind of left in the dust. It's not recommended to be used anymore, and you should be using Task.Wait, which is the newer updated version of wait. And the difference between them is, you know, wait is actually based on heartbeat, and this is all like based on the task scheduler. So if you don't know any of this, that's fine, you know, you can look it up. You don't really need to know the differences between the two, you just need to know Task.Wait is better. But Task.Wait is actually based on heartbeat, and I'm pretty sure wait will run after render step instead of on heartbeat like Task.Wait does. So Task.Wait is actually much more accurate and optimized for your code. If you didn't know, when you use wait 1, it's not going to actually wait exactly 1 second, because the game actually has to go through a bunch of different processes to check things, and once it checks this, you know, usually it'll be a little bit inaccurate. It'll be like 1.03 or 1.02 or something seconds instead of being exactly 1 second. And in that case, when you're trying to do very accurate debounces or cooldowns, something better to do would to be use os.clock, which is actually how I prefer to do my debounces. So what you do is you make a variable and you make it equal to os.clock. And now what os.clock is it's actually just seconds. So once the server starts, or there's actually this is based off of CPU runtime actually, but that's not very important for this. Basically all this does is every second this will increase by 1. So it's very exact, it will always be exact. It's much more exact than using Task.Wait. Now however, this does not pause or yield the script like wait or Task.Wait does. This is just a way of measuring time in seconds, right? So instead of yielding the script and pausing it, which is actually, you know, not preferred, you don't really want to yield your threads unless you have to. It's kind of better to let them run freely. So instead of that, what we can do is we can actually say we want to wait 1 second. We can just do, you can take the last tick variable and you can make it equal to os.clock plus 1. So os.clock gives us the exact time in seconds at the like point in time we're in. It doesn't matter actually what the number is. All we need to know is that we're setting this to 1 more second. So after another second, right, then this will be triggered or whatever. No, that doesn't make any sense. Ignore what I said there. So we're just setting this to be 1 more second than the current time, right? Now in our debounce function, we're going to get rid of this. We don't need that anymore. In our debounce function, all we'll do is we'll compare last tick, and we'll see if last tick is greater than the current time. So if last tick is greater than the current time, then we're going to return an end, which means that we're going to skip. If it's not greater than the current time, then we're going to continue on with your script, and then we're going to actually increase the last tick again to make sure that it's updated for the debounce. So instead of yielding the script, all this does is it just kind of measures time, and it compares the future, like when the cooldown is actually up compared to the current time, to see if the current time is still too early. And if it is still too early, then it just, you know, it doesn't do anything. And if it's past the time that is determined in our last tick variable, then it will continue on and do something, right? So that's pretty much all I wanted to go over in this video. I think I did a lot of things. One thing I didn't mention really was comments, and you know, I have kind of an issue with commenting code as well, but something that you should probably do is, you know, label different sections of your code with comments. You know, you can label them different things, like here we'll have our main functions after this, and up here we can define our variables, and we can also label like our different variables like getting services or control variables, whatever, right? And then one more thing to do is, you know, we can comment different lines of code that, you know, if the line has like a lot of things going on in that line, or if it's a lot of confusing things going on, you know, you want to add a comment to tell yourself in the future when you're trying to edit your code what that line is actually doing. Like this line, obviously it's just a cooldown, it's just checking the debounce, but we can just comment it out to tell you what it's saying. I don't know, it's not a very good comment there, but you know, you kind of get the idea. You want to comment your lines to make it more cleaner and organized, and in the future when you're going back and reading over it, you can look and see what different things are for, so that way you don't have to spend time trying to reread it and recomprehend what your script's doing entirely. You can just read your comments and be like, easily figure out what it's doing immediately, instead of having to trace code and everything like that. So that's this video for styling your code and making your code look nice and sexy so people don't bully you on the internet. And that's pretty much it for this video, and I'll see you guys later.